This is episode 433 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, some Albuquerque Journal polls came out this week, and if they are accurate, which is always a reasonable question to ask about polling data these days, but this is Brian Sanderoff, who has been a fixture in New Mexico politics for many, many years. His polls seem to be the best available, and right now they are claiming Michelle Lujan Grisham with a 7-point lead over Mark Ronchetti. I'm going to go into a little bit of the details here in a bit, but as a starting point, 47-40, 5% for Libertarian Karen Bedoni, 8% undecided. And, that's a slap in the face or a cold slap of water, I guess, for those of us who would like to see some new blood in New Mexico politics, especially given the way this governor has taken a pretty radical approach to New Mexico government for her 4 years in office, moving New Mexico dramatically leftward on all manner of issues. Any initial thoughts on this particular poll? And then we've got, of course, journal polls on other races statewide. But what's your take on this governor's race?
Well, first of all, as you say, Sanderoff tends to be a relatively straightforward, the word accurate and polling don't really apply, but it's his polls tend to be close to what the elections are compared to nationally. We've seen a lot of polls where, particularly like in the Trump presidential election, people just don't want to give their answer. They feel like if they give their answer, somehow that will put them on a special list. In New Mexico, it's been more straightforward, and I think it was probably going to be a little bit closer until the Supreme Court came out on their ruling moving abortion back to the states. Having said that, as we know, New Mexico's abortion laws are among the most liberal in the world here in New Mexico. So that's probably not a big short-term issue, but not surprising. And then when you look at, the details of that poll, and I did take a few minutes looking at it, the number of Democrats relative to the number of Republicans is huge. And so, you have to have something go on. Having said that, it's a ways away from the election. The gas prices and the economy were hitting everyone square in the face on a daily basis. It's amazing how even though people say, oh, gasoline price doesn't matter, it matters a lot. Going down a little bit has probably taken a little of the pressure off. But, man, there's a lot of inflation out there. The Fed's raising the interest rate. Could we have a recession before the general election? What would that mean? These are all questions, but things will keep going on how they are until they change. And right now, absent something, and I won't call it a November surprise. That's not typically been how politics has worked in New Mexico. I've never seen anything that I thought was all that compelling that came out late from a news point of view. But absent something macro, it's going to continue to be a tough road for Ronchetti to get there. Does it mean he can't? No, it doesn't. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but it's just one of those. I do think that if the election were held today, I do believe that Michelle Lujan Grisham would be governor.
Yeah. So a few things. One is recent days after some strong recovery, the stock market has kind of gone down. Powell's comments there about some pain still to come. Definitely the economy, while it in some ways had seemed to be showing signs of life, that remains an issue regardless of unemployment rate. Also, of course, there's Trump making his way back into the headlines, which seems to drive polls downward for Republicans. And I don't know if that's a calculated thing by the Biden administration, but boy, bringing Trump back to make him the whipping boy of the Democrats, and it just those independents, for whatever reason, when it comes to polls, they don't show much favor for Trump. Now down into the Journal poll, and of course the abortion issue seems to have really revitalized Democrats and their kind of passion for this election. It's not that Democrats wouldn't vote Democratic, but it's just what would the vote numbers be like?
And then when you look at the underlying data regarding people's attitude in New Mexico with regard to abortion, it doesn't look like the gubernatorial poll should skew that much towards Michelle Lujan Grisham in terms of what it is. But I do think, elections are about who votes. And to the extent that who they're calling up to poll is who votes, that's the case. And so,
Right.
strongly held political beliefs not acted upon at the ballot box doesn't make any difference.
Yeah, and I think the one they break it down by gender, ethnicity, etc., education levels. There's been a lot of talk about Hispanics across the United States moving towards the Republican camp, and Hispanic is a very big word. It's everything from Cuban Americans to Puerto Ricans to folks from Mexico who have been here for a few days, and folks like many New Mexicans who have been here for a few 100 years. And what
they came through Mexico before Mexico was a country to get to
and they often came to New Mexico before New Mexico was part of the United States. So yeah, it's there's a lot of variation there in that Hispanic number, but according to Sandorov's poll, 56% of Hispanics falling in line for Lujan Grisham, 32% for Ronchetti. You'd have to think that if that number were to migrate even just towards more of a 10-point differential, that Ronchetti would have an advantage. And it's one of those things, you hear people talk about it, you see the data, and you just wonder what groups of Hispanics are driving that difference. And, a lot of times around the country, Hispanics are often, just kind of seen as people who are one or two generations into the United States. And that is generally not the case as much in New Mexico. Obviously, again, a diverse population here in New Mexico, but numerically dominated by people who have been in the United States for a very long time. And I've often questioned, as the Democratic Party has moved way to the left on economic and social issues, including the legacy of the Hispanic founders of the state of New Mexico, what will it take for those people to move into at least political competition, let alone Republican dominance, given the long track record of Democrat control of New Mexico, but their ideology moving far to the left. And at least according to this poll right now, as we sit here, so far Hispanics still remain firmly tied to the Democratic Party in New Mexico, which, again, I don't know. What will it take?
Yeah, and then just two more things that they're going to sound like they're might be a little out there, but I think they're real. It's, James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. Well, the economy is a mixed bag right now. We have really, really high inflation, but there is unemployment is relatively low. Workforce participation is also low in New Mexico. But our friends over in Europe are looking at a huge challenge this fall into the winter, and worldwide recessions don't have to start in the good old U.S. of A. They could definitely start in Europe, and so with their energy issues and what's going on with Russia and the Ukraine, and not having the natural gas flow into Europe, Europe's to quote the line from "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" We're in a tight spot there in Europe, and that could have dramatic effects on the world before we pull pull the lever, and that shows how old I am, Paul. There's no more levers, but until we fill in our little dot and put it in the voting machine this November.
Well, I agree with you, and there are already very dramatic price increases, let alone some of the restrictions that we've seen over in Europe. But yeah, I'm not sure how many Americans or New Mexicans are going to draw the dotted line between the policies that Democrats have been enacting here in the United States with those European challenges and woes. And
Well, and you know what? That's a bridge too far for New Mexico for this November. But I do think if the stock market were to, go down 25%, and things would general economics would be just horrible. But to the issue you were talking about, we've talked about how the United States is seeking to implement a very German-like environmental policy, and we're seeing how it's working out in Germany. So not too well, at least right this at the moment.
Yeah. And just to kind of run through Secretary of State, Attorney General, State Treasurer, and Lands Commissioner, all of those currently have Democrats leading anywhere from 45%, 49%, 44%, 46%, with Republicans in the mid 30% range. Much more undecided voters than normal, not normal, than in the governor's race, mid double digits kind of numbers. So there's definitely opportunities for a strong candidacy to emerge on the Republican side. There hasn't been as much spending because those are all lower profile races on media buys as we've seen in the governor's race. But it's coming down to the wire here as we get into the Labor Day weekend when the stretch run really begins to November, and somebody's going to have to come up with some creative ways to break into that lead. Not a surprise to me that Ronchetti has a bit of an inside track on the governor when it comes to at least the relative distance he has to make up. Ronchetti's proven that he can outperform candidates like President Trump, and the governor has been uniquely, I think, unpopular in a lot of her approaches while in office, but not enough for a majority, at least so far. So we shall see. The only poll that really matters is Election Day, and we'll have more analysis between now and then because that's what everybody is worried about and concerned about. So we had another opinion piece. This one, I have to say that, sometimes you write an op-ed, and if a tree falls in the forest and you don't hear anything about it, you wonder if anybody read it, and that's the way things go. But I wrote an article that appeared in several newspapers across the state about New Mexico's self-inflicted doctor shortage. And it's pretty well understood across the political spectrum that New Mexico has a doctor shortage, and not just a doctor, but medical provider shortage. There are a lot of ways to address the issue, but I wrote about 3 because these are really the simplest and most self-inflicted ways that we could address the doctor shortage here in New Mexico. We have a medical malpractice bill, HB 75, that was passed in 2021. It was delayed on implementation, a lot like the Energy Transition Act shutdown of the San Juan generating station. Get that through the election, and then we'll have the conversation about what's going to happen to that medical malpractice bill. I don't think the Democrats are going to repeal it, but it raises the caps on potential damages paid out by doctors and their insurance all the way up to $6 million per incident in a few years. Texas has a cap of $250,000. So this was written about by a Democrat, Dr. James Tryon, in an article he wrote, and it's a widely acknowledged problem, I think, on both sides of the aisle, that this medical malpractice bill could cause some real problems, and it's something that might be a dog that barks here between now and Election Day. And quite frankly, I wish it had come up before then. But then you have the gross receipts tax. We don't need to elaborate on that because we kind of have that drinking game going, but simply put, a lot of medical providers have to pay gross receipts tax on services, including Medicaid services they provide. It really doesn't make sense, and it's not done in other states. And then the governor with her vaccine mandate, and we don't know exactly how many people may have left the state who were doctors and nurses, but in an August 2021 report, David Scrace, the guru of COVID for Governor Lujan Grisham, said that 90% of nurses were vaccinated. Roughly 3,000 healthcare workers in New Mexico were unvaccinated. Now, just say that 2/3 of those people remained unvaccinated and or left the profession or the state. You're talking, a lot of nurses, a lot of medical professionals, and that's enough to exacerbate the shortage. We still have this policy in place, by the way, something that could easily be turned around by this governor. So, if I'm advising the campaign of Ronchetti, which I'd find that to be an interesting job because, taking policy and really hammering that as opposed to some of the stuff that winds up being so focused upon in campaigns. I'm not saying I would do a great job, but it would be fun to really wield the policy sword heavily in a campaign because I'm not going to, focus on some of these personality questions. But anyway, maybe that issue will be discussed here in the next couple months.
Yes, and Paul, since this issue has started to emerge, I've been asking around, and boy, there are a lot of time delays between when you're identified to see a specialist or get a procedure like a MRI or a upper GI exam or anything else in New Mexico. And to your point, it depends who those people were that were unvaccinated and left the state. It doesn't, 50 specialists would make a dramatic impact. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's like 50 home healthcare aides, maybe not so much in the short term. They could be replaced, but you are not going to replace a pediatric neurologist quickly and easily in some of these other specialties that New Mexico struggled with under the best of circumstances from a being competitive place, a place that doctors want to apply their trade here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and it's obviously here in Albuquerque something that to an extent we don't feel as much as people outside of Albuquerque and in a lot of the rural areas where you just don't have the number of doctors operating, especially those specialists. And, again, as I said at the outset of this talking point, I've heard a lot of feedback and a lot of, positive comments, especially from Las Cruces, where that's one of the papers this ran in. You have, I think, more challenges in some of those, not necessarily rural areas, but smaller cities. Las Cruces is more dependent on El Paso and places outside of New Mexico where folks can go. And maybe that's okay for everybody, that if you need a doctor in Las Cruces, by and large, you just have to resign yourself to going down to El Paso. That may be well and good, but it's one thing to talk about a shortage and the challenges thereof, but it's another thing to draw the line to the policy, and I hope that this does help with that, and hopefully folks who are concerned, which we have an aging population, certainly in New Mexico, it's something that folks might take a look at between here and Election Day. So that medical malpractice issue, though, really, again, that hasn't taken effect fully yet, and you could make the case, as bad as things are now, wait till we have this increased fee structure in place, this increased payout structure that's going to really, I think, impact people very deeply. But we'll see.
Yeah, the trial attorneys are ready to go. They're ready to sue our doctors and drive them out of state, and they're going to have a big stick and a nice tool to do that relative to other places if this law isn't amended in relatively short order.
Yeah. Now, last week, the California Air Resources Board adopted, based on an executive order from Governor Gavin Newsom, a rule that will eliminate the sale of internal combustion engines in the state of California by 2035. And that is potentially going to have real impacts here in New Mexico. Now, and I'll apologize right here to our listeners. I understood, based on a lot of information, that this was California leading the charge and we follow them wherever they go. Apparently, that is not the case. My caveat and my apology is that, unlike traditional public policy, this was not a legislative bill passed through with all the analysis that comes from folks at the legislature. In fact, I have not found to this moment a actual copy of what New Mexico implemented. You can look through the environmental department and the environmental improvement board, and you can find a lot of different entities that were involved in this. I haven't seen exactly what we have adopted in the state of New Mexico. And again, this was done through an unelected board. So we are somehow following California on a initial policy, which we've talked about, but at least as of right now, New Mexico has not agreed to follow the elimination of internal combustion engines in the not too distant future. 2035 is when that policy takes effect in California, although 35% of new vehicles sold in California by 2026 must be zero emission vehicles. So, again, this is a policy that I think could be discussed in this election. Hey, Michelle Lujan Grisham, are you going to follow California down the path of eliminating gas-powered vehicles in the state of New Mexico? You've already followed them to the initial policy that they implemented, and with California now taking this next step, are we going to follow them with you as governor? Because this doesn't have to be done through the legislature. It can be done through this unelected environmental improvement board. So I don't know. We shall see where this policy leads here in New Mexico and in California. I suspect it's going to be very, very difficult to comply, given the size of California and the challenges of ramping up electric vehicle production. But it's just it's very difficult to understand these policies, especially when you don't have the kind of track record of the legislative process and the light that's inherently shed on those policies as they make their way through an elected body.
Yeah, Paul, I've talked in the past about aspirational regulation. We'd like this to happen. And I've come to the conclusion, if anything begins with a phrase similar to by 2025, by 2030, by 2035, so on and so forth, it's based on, what shall we say? A word that begins with B, baloney, balderall, something. It's this weird thing where, like, we're hoping for a miracle to happen, but we don't have a policy. You know what I mean? These things are not a policy. And we saw quite a few of those in the Obama administration that were put out there, and then they had to be pulled back at the last minute because they aren't real. I do think that their underlying focus is, say, we'd like the private sector and we'd like everybody to really work really hard on this. But it's make no mistake, these things are not implementation plans. We don't know where we can get enough minerals to make the batteries. We're not sure that the electricity grid can be doubled. We're not sure what it's going to power the electricity grid to do this. And so, yeah, these things are out there. I think I think they're well received by the far left part of the political spectrum and not necessarily looked down upon as much by the right. So I think they're kind of a low risk way to speak to certain parts of the electorate without necessarily getting others really upset. But we'll see how these things go forward. And again, this is just a data point, but it now costs more to charge your electric vehicle in Germany than it does to fill it up with gasoline or petrol, as we like to call it in Europe, or diesel fuel. So, things are very dynamic in the energy sector, and this wind solar battery, wind solar battery, wind solar battery. There's going to have to be a awful lot of technologies other than those, or this thing is going to come to a screeching halt, crashing down around the ears and heads of anyone who's in the countries that just do this at the rate things are going.
Yeah, it's definitely a policy that is going to be rocky in its implementation in California alone, let alone other states that try to adopt the policy. And it's going to be very expensive from the subsidized perspective. We just saw this so-called Inflation Reduction Act has nothing to do with inflation, increasing subsidies for electric vehicles, which don't really exist yet because they're not made in the United States. We're assuming that the Biden administration or some Democrat presidency would abandon that requirement. But you've got a lot of different policies at play, not the least of which is the stability of California's electrical grid and other states that go down this path. How do you pay for roads, maintenance, and how do you dispose of and deal with the waste of these batteries and the environmental impacts that the mining and all the different processes, put into the environment. It's a massive, massive situation and challenge. And it's been I'll admit it. We've it's been a tough couple of weeks, especially as Biden has gotten some of his policies pushed through, or just with a magic wand put forth. The Inflation Reduction Act is terrible, terrible legislation. Just a left-wing grab bag giveaway at all different levels. And right up there with that policy is the student loan boondoggle of the Biden administration. Of course, that one, hundreds of billions of dollars in costs. The idea behind it, you've probably heard about it, but it's worth going into some level of detail because it's just so awful. $10,000 of debt per borrower will be wiped away for individuals making less than $125,000 per year, while those making $250,000 a year as a family will have the ability to do that. Then you have Pell Grants and others specifically targeted for even more generous forgiveness. But this was all done, and the first and foremost, the most problematic issue is that Congress holds the power of the purse. The president by himself is the one who put this policy forth. I hope and assume that there will be some legal challenges here. Probably Congress is the right avenue for those, and it's something that should be done forthwith, because you just can't have, whether it's my mortgage, whether it's debt on car payments, whatever it may be, people should not be incentivized to take on this debt and then have the expectation that at some point it's going to be paid off through arbitrary action of one politician in Washington, D.C. And again, Democrats talk a big game about democracy, and then you have one guy doing what Biden just did. It's crazy. $300 billion in costs, which is massive, again, for one person enacting the policy. And there's talk of anywhere between 300 and 600 billion. You just don't know how much this thing's going to cost, but it's by far and away the most significant expenditure ever put forth by one person, by the president. It's not fair. It's regressive. People who make less money, who are working in more, they're doing plumbing, they're doing electrical, maybe they don't make less money, maybe they make more, but they didn't go to college. Those are the people who are going to be paying off these student loans for people. It's just it's totally unfair for those kinds of folks, and we are only exacerbating the price increases of higher education. The system in New Mexico is already going to see so-called free college paid for by the taxpayers thanks to Lujan Grisham and the legislature, which that program, the Opportunity Scholarships, just came into effect back in July. Now we're going to see more money poured into higher education. There's simply no constraints when it comes to spending at colleges and universities.
Yeah, and that is a huge issue that this, if anything, will help to perpetuate, not address in any way, shape, or form, and that is the cost of higher education, much less the value of higher education, depending on what your degree is in. And believe me, I'm not one that totally looks down upon a kind of liberal arts education and the ability to think, but also, just as you look at the price, things government gets involved with, particularly federal government, from a price point of view, tend to skyrocket. We've certainly seen that with education. So, it's one of those, to become a electrical engineer. College is still a requirement and a good value, but there's a lot of people that go to colleges and come out with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt with an educational background that really it's very dubious as to how they're ever going to get a return on that investment. And but Santa Claus comes to the rescue, at least for $10,000 worth.
Yeah, and there was certainly almost a memo situation where you hear these talking points and you realize that somebody, either in the Biden administration or some Democrat activist, kind of got this message out to people. Compare the PPP loan situation and forgiveness of those to the student loan situation. It's just the same. And you heard these talking points come out across the country, and businesses that took PPP and got loan forgiveness for that. And of course, PPP is the program that came out due to the
payroll
shutdown
protection plan
of our economy,
right.
Due to COVID. Businesses that were able to keep and hang on to employees, keep their lights on, not go out of business, that they are being compared to people who took out student loans. And the same thing for big businesses and tax reform plans that pass through Congress. Well, first and foremost, the PPP plan passed through both houses of Congress. I don't know if there was a single vote against it. If not, it was maybe a single vote against the PPP. It was totally bipartisan. Whether that was the best policy at the time, the fact is if you're going to shut down the economy at the government level, unless you want even more chaos than we had, you need to put something in place to help those businesses out. And so comparing and that issue is just, there's no comparison. These student loans were taken out on the understanding that you're going to pay them back, and then having one person, the president, just say, "Oh, I'm going to wipe the slate clean or take $10,000." It's absolutely apples to kumquats or apples to fighter jets. I don't know.
Yeah, and the only pushback I've seen on the other side, frankly, Paul, I've seen a lot of the comparison to the PPP, which I don't know. I was like, huh? I saw a farmer that said, my farm loan identifies as a student loan, so maybe I could get my $10,000. So it's one of those things. There's a lot of debt out there that are taken on in a lot of places, and why is this one get special treatment? And then the other thing is we're seeing a lot of pushback on this, things I've read about. It's a very class thing. So if you don't have the benefit of a college education, you're going out into a trade or you're just making your way in the workforce. Where was my money? So, there's when you do things like this, it certainly creates an issue. And then the price tag, I don't know. I've seen numbers all the way up to $1 trillion. So, but what's a couple of hundred million, or excuse me, a couple of $100 billion between friends? But we're getting to the point where, just to put this into perspective, if my back of the envelope math is correct, $1 trillion is $3,000 plus for every man, woman, and child in the United States. And so, we're not talking small money. So even if it's half that, we're talking big money spread very widely, but at a very specific target.
Yeah, and lastly, of the policy reforms or tax reductions. We have a very, very progressive tax structure in the United States. Whether corporations should even pay taxes is certainly an open question, because corporations aren't people. All they do is pass along those tax burdens to whoever their shareholders are and whatnot, and those people eventually pay taxes. So you're really creating double taxation. Just because somebody got a high amount of tax relief in a federal bill, like Trump's Tax Cut and Jobs Act, doesn't, again, is not the equivalent of just one person forgiving these student loans by themselves. And the Tax Cuts and Job Act, as studied, has actually resulted in more tax revenues. There were more tax dollars generated after it than there were before that act was passed.
Yeah, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act actually helped tax cuts and jobs.
Yeah.
Man, I hope the Inflation Reduction Act does something to reduce inflation, although I think that remains to be seen. I don't see how that's anything to do with inflation. It just was they must have done a focus group and say, yeah, we need inflation reduction. Let's call it that.
Yeah. Well, sadly, you're definitely going to hear a lot of commentary about the Biden student loan forgiveness plan. We'll see where that shakes out on any challenges to it and whatnot. I have seen some commentary from some somewhat surprising places, like the Washington Post editorial board, saying, hey, this is not a good policy. And real quick, it is important to note that the state of New Mexico spends more than any other state in the country when measured against its overall economy. So the way you do this is not by person, because when you have California with extremely high costs and high living standards, government is not going to look as big as it does in New Mexico. Where we really want to study or use data is what is compared against the overall state economy. So how much does the state government consume as a percentage of your overall economy? According to the website usgovernmentspending.com, which you can view the data at Heirs of Enchantment, New Mexico tops the nation in spending as a percentage of the economy. 17.49% of state spending, of the state's economy, is government spending, state spending. The next highest state is Alaska at 16.99, West Virginia 16.22, Vermont 16.07, and Hawaii at 15.93, and so on. New Mexico government spending is massive, and unless a absolute miracle happens, well, it will go up. I think the question is what the legislature and the governorship look like in New Mexico come January. Perhaps Ronchetti and a more Republican-leaning House can restrain spending a little bit, but Katie bar the door if Lujan Grisham gets back in there and she continues to have the Democrat majorities that she's had in recent years. You're going to have a massive, massive growth in already what amounts to the very largest state government in the entire U.S. of A. So this is one of the many, many issues that can and should be addressed in this election campaign. What is all that state spending getting us? it's hard to say that it's getting us a whole heck of a lot in terms of better outcomes, from education to crime to anything else. But here we are. New Mexico is number one.
Yeah, and it brings to mind my one of my top 5 favorite economists, Mr. Arthur Laffer, the Laffer curve, is that just because you're collecting ever more taxes, you can get to the point where it causes your economy to shrink and go the other way. And New Mexico's economy, because of the oil and gas industry, is it's pretty powerful right now as generation of funds for the state. But we have a lot of things, as we've talked about, that in the non-oil and gas sector, we have, crime, regulation, high taxes, poor public schools, and taxes, if they're not too high, boy, it seems to me that we're right at the cusp of them damaging economic growth. And when you look at New Mexico, how we do relative to other states in terms of creating new business and creating jobs and growing, as opposed to maintaining the status quo and shrinking, we're not looking real good, and we haven't now for a number of years. And throw COVID into the mix, that certainly didn't help, but we have some very big structural issues with regard to our economy and tax policy that now we have money to address them in Santa Fe. What will they do?
Yeah, and we certainly would like to see a reduction of state government and reduction in tax revenues and burdens across the board in ways that are targeted to diversifying our economy and making New Mexico a more attractive place to do business. The radical environmentalists often talk about we've got to diversify our economy away from oil and gas. And while we're not in the cut off oil and gas right now category by any stretch of the imagination, we at least philosophically do share some desire to diversify our economy. Unfortunately, when you actually talk to the left about details, they get a lot of blank stares and, we're going to make wind and solar the basis of our economy. Well, you can't subsidize something and make it the base of your economy at the same time. And there's a lot of problems with that. But that is the way we will conclude things. This was, like I said, a particularly tough week or so between the not so optimistic polling data and some of these horrendous policies coming out of California and the federal government. I hope for better times ahead for all of our sakes, whether it's the rule of law or just our fiscal situation nationally or at the state level. But nonetheless, you remain up to date and informed about what's going on, no matter how depressing it may be. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.